In February of 2019, then Mayor of Stockton, California, Michael Tubbs launched that city's universal basic income experiment. More than a year later, results from that study are in. So those who received the payments actually began working more, and most money was spent on basic needs, things like food, home goods, and utilities. The study also found participants were physically healthier and they were less stressed.
Really interesting. Former mayor of Stockton, founder of Mayors for a Guaranteed Income, Michael Tubbs, he joins us now to discuss that report. Mr. Mayor, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So tell us a little about the results of your study, why you felt it was so important, how you were able to implement it, and what it tells us about this program in the future.
Economic insecurity is the most pressing issue of our time. I think a lot of the things we argue about, whether it's homelessness, whether it's educational attainment, whether it's crime, it's rooted in the fact that so many Americans are in poverty or one paycheck away from poverty. And it was in that spirit, in the spirit of Dr. King, we launched the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration, our basic income pilot. And what we found is that what folks have been telling me for 2 years and what people have been saying for the last 30, 40 years in this country about the economy and how it functions and who it works for are lies. The first lie was this notion that something as small as $500 a month would make it so that people would decide to not work, that people would lose their ingenuity, their desire to be creative, their drive to be self-reliant. And what we found based on the data is that the opposite is true, that $500 was enough to allow people to exit exploitative jobs, exploitative relationships, and find full-time work with stable hours, with benefits. It allowed people to pay for things like transportation and childcare and interview clothes, which make them more likely to find full-time employment. And we also saw that there's almost a 2 times difference in unemployment between those who received the guaranteed income or the $500 and those who didn't. We also saw just the health impacts and effects. Medicine is important for sure, but if you look at the data, on the Kessler scale, the way that people who receive the guaranteed income decline in stress levels and decline in depression are comparable to clinical trials of Prozac, meaning that so much or some of the depression we see and the mental illness we see is probably triggered by the fact we live in an insane society that allows so many people to go without, that allows so many people to be one paycheck away from ruin or to live in poverty. And the third thing we found is that a guaranteed income represents smart pandemic contingency preparedness and contingency planning, meaning that we know we live in a time of pandemics, and for folks who received $500 a month, they were able to build economic resilience so that when 2020 came, the year after these results covered, folks were in a better position to survive and to not be torn economically by COVID-19. So I am so proud of these results. I think it goes to show us that we can trust regular people with money, just like we trust the richest top 1% in this country. And I think it provides a way forward into how do we live up to our democratic values.
Personally, I think we should be trusting those rich people a lot less and the regular people you're talking about a lot more. And I do think that speaks to one of the core things that you've exposed here is really there's been a bipartisan classist attitude over the past 40 years that you can't trust poor people with money. You got to tell them how they can spend it. You got to tightly constrain it. Oh, if you just give them money, they're going to spend it on alcohol and cigarettes and drugs. What did you find with regards to how the money was actually spent and what it did for these people's lives?
What's amazing is that we found, and no surprise to you all, but people are people. So people spend money the way you and I spend money. So people spent their dollars on car maintenance. They spent their money on food. They spent their money on their kids. They spent their money on childcare. They spent their money on helping others. One young man, Tomas, talked about how in the first month of the Guaranteed Income Pilot, he was able to take time off of his part-time, no pay time off work to interview and apply for a job that he actually wanted to do. And he asked, why didn't you do that before? And he said, well, I lived paycheck to paycheck. So even taking a risk to bet on myself for something I knew I was qualified for was too much of a risk for me to take because I can't afford to lose the $200 from taking off time off work. And that got me to think about how many people are trapped because we know that poverty is expensive. We know that economic insecurity compounds. And to your point about this bipartisan agreement around how we treat poor people, I think it's a mixture of classism, but also racist. When we think of like the welfare queen tropes, when we think of sort of the images that come up when we talk about people who are poor, oftentimes those images, although numerically not true, are images of people of color, are images of black people, are images of black women. So I'm excited about this demonstration to provide data to say, like, no, these tropes we have about people who struggle just aren't true. The issue isn't that people don't want to work, it's that our economy doesn't work for working people.
Yeah.
The issue isn't that people are people who have more money or smarter or harder working. In fact, the hardest working people in our society, I argue, are probably the people who get paid minimum wage, who are doing the work of caregiving, who are doing the work of field work, et cetera.
So, Mr. Mayor, what do you think about the broader prospects? Now that this has come out, you're part of this group. Are there others who are following your example? How does that look like?
Yeah, we have 44 mayors who are now a part of Mayors for Guaranteed Income who have all stood up and said, we want to do a basic income pilot. The city of Compton, California, under Mayor Asia Brown, is doing 800 people. The city of St. Paul, Minnesota, is doing 150 people. They were the first pilot in this country to use government dollars. They use CARES Act dollars and private dollars to fund their pilot. The city of Los Angeles, under Mayor Garcetti and Councilman Curran Price, just announced a redirection from police budget dollars to provide a basic income for folks living in South LA. City of Pittsburgh, city of Tallahassee, city of Atlanta, Georgia, city of Oak, like there's throughout Madison, Wisconsin, there's 42 cities across this country that are now saying, not only are we going to pilot, but during this pandemic, the stimulus checks need to be reoccurring. That we need to make sure that folks have what they need to survive and also do better once we're done with COVID-19.
And what are your reflections on the way that this debate has changed? Because this year, people got direct. It went from being basically off the table direct cash aid to now one of the most popular and powerful tools in all of American politics. What do you make of that transformation?
I think what I make of it is that folks are wising up, that the biggest and smartest investment that the government can make is an investment directly in people. And all people, with the priority given to those who desperately need it, who absolutely need it. So I'm amazed at how much the pendulum has swung. I think partners like the Economic Security Project, Congress people like Rev. Ilhan, even VP Harris had a bill when she was senator with Senator Sanders about reoccurring stimulus checks, have really kind of created, and then we see this child tax credit in the stimulus plan, that's a guaranteed income essentially for parents, have really swung the pendulum. And now I think it's the job of mayors, former mayors, and constituents to keep advocating, keep pushing, because we know what works. We just have to figure out we have the political will to do it.
Yeah. Great talking to you, Mayor Tubbs. Thank you so much for breaking down what the results were in your city. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for having me.
Next up on Rising, we've got writer for The Atlantic, Derek Thompson. He's talking about combating COVID vaccine refusal. That's when Rising returns.